Bomber Fox at your service. Today I will be providing a response to a video a friend recommended. Perhaps I will join the debunking creationism trend, maybe not, but let's get started.
I've always been a logical and curious kind of person. I mean, that's just my personality. I remember when I was little, my parents gave me an electric train for Christmas. And then a couple hours later, my dad finds me in the garage, and I'm throwing the locomotive against the cement floor, trying to break it open. He said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm just trying to figure out how it works."
Or you could have asked Daddy for a screwdriver and actually take it apart in a more responsible fashion, just like I took apart computer parts.
I mean, my parents, because of all the why questions I would ask, finally went out and said, "Here," and they bought me an encyclopedia and said, "Look, the answers are in there. Go look for them. Go find them yourself." I mean, that's just the way I was. And so I guess it's natural that I would become a journalist, because journalists are looking for facts, they're looking for evidence, they're looking for data, they're looking for something that they can publish in the paper and have confidence it is true.
Lee Strobel earned a Master of Studies in Law degree from Yale Law School and is the former legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. He is the best-selling author of several books that explore the evidence for the Christian faith.
Lee Strobel has written some books, but I will be arguing against this particular one based on this documentary. His biography checks out, but keep in mind anecdotes are the poorest form of evidence, especially in science.
Curiosity, it's not surprising that when I was in high school, science was my favorite topic, because there the teachers actually encouraged me to cut open frogs and find out how things work, which I thought was great.
Is it me, or is this guy just a little too happy about cutting up frogs?
When I was a teenager, I had this deep trust in science, and I think part of it was prompted by the fact that I grew up in post-Sputnik America, where Eisenhower encouraged all young people to delve into science so we could catch up with the Russians.
Yes, when Republicans also accepted science, when they didn't fight tooth and nail against every significant advancement in our understanding of the world and the universe. Weren't those the days?
So to me, science sort of represented the empirical, the hard facts, the things that could be proven experimentally, and that was sort of the way in which I looked at life. I thought people who had faith, people who believed in supernatural things like God, I saw that as a sign of weakness, because, do you have any data to back that up?
In the autumn of 1966, Strobel's interest in science led to a life-changing decision.
I can take you back to the exact spot where I was sitting. It was in the third floor, overlooking the asphalt parking lot. I was in the second row, the third chair from the front, when my biology teacher recounted in great detail this experiment that had been conducted in the early 1950s at the University of Chicago.
This experiment that impressed Strobel so deeply was one of the most famous in the history of science. In 1953, Stanley Miller, a graduate chemistry student, tried to demonstrate how life first emerged on Earth. Miller attempted to reproduce the Earth's early atmosphere. He pumped hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and a small amount of water vapor into a maze of glassware.
The Miller-Urey experiment was not as simplistic as the video shows. It had two sibling studies. One was a spark experiment and the other simulated volcanic environments. It turned out that the experiment simulating a volcanic environment created more amino acids than the spark experiment.
Then sparked the gases with electrical discharges to simulate lightning. After 5 days, he discovered what he had hoped for. A few simple amino acids, the basic building blocks of living organisms, had collected in the dark residue at the bottom of the glass. Many hailed Miller's experiment as proof that essential components of life could have formed in the oceans of the Earth billions of years ago.
The philosophical implications of Miller's experiment were instantly obvious to me. And for me, it was a eureka moment, because I heard this and I thought, wait a minute. If you can show scientifically that life can emerge without any outside assistance, if life can emerge just from naturalistic circumstances, then God was out of a job.
Or you could just find another gap to fit God in. How convenient.
From there, the acceptance of Darwinian evolution, and full-blown atheism for that matter, was pretty easy. Because if living organisms could emerge by themselves out of this primordial soup without the assistance of any kind of a god or supernatural intervention, then they certainly could develop naturally over the eons into more and more complex creatures, just as Charles Darwin theorized in his book On the Origin of Species.
As Strobel embraced Darwinism and its atheistic implications, he was surprised to discover that many Christians believed their faith was compatible with Darwinian evolution.
There's no way you can harmonize neo-Darwinism with Christianity. I could never understand Christians who would say, well, you know, I believe in God, and yet I believe in evolution as well.
Not really. Darwinism is accepted by most Christians, even the Catholic Church. Darwin really put forth the idea of natural selection, as it was already known that animals descend with modification, and early models of life were available. Evolution involves the change in allele frequencies over successive generations, and natural selection involves species adapting to their environment. These shysters are trying to herd a crowd with the no true Christian hat trick. I'm not a Christian, but it really annoys me when creationists try to pull this trick.
You see, Darwin's ideas about the development of life led to his theory that modern science now generally defines as an undirected process, completely devoid of any purpose or plan. Now, how could God direct an undirected process? How could God have purpose and a plan behind a system that has no plan and no purpose? It just does not make sense. Didn't make sense to me in 1966, and it doesn't make sense to me now.
Tell that to the guy who sequenced the human genome. Psst, he probably doesn't think bats are birds either. Adaptations served many a purpose for the organism in question, but they are not planned. The simple answer is they believe that their God did not need to cultivate every single trait involved. It merely created the genesis for life. Your first mistake was equating evolution with abiogenesis. Those are different theories.
In 1972, Lee Strobel married Leslie Herdler. 5 years later, Leslie, an agnostic, became a Christian.
And I thought, this is divorce. This is going to be the end of our marriage.
Dude, why would you divorce your wife over simple beliefs? That's just low.
But all the negative things I expected to happen in her as a result of her newfound faith, they didn't happen. And instead, I saw positive changes in her values and her character and the way she related to me and the children. And I thought, wait a minute, she is attributing this to God. And I don't believe God exists. And so that was the main thing that prompted me to say, maybe I need to really investigate this and get to the bottom of this and determine, is there really any rational way I could ever believe that this kind of a God really exists and really causes this kind of transformation in a human being? And so I decided to use my legal training and journalism training, my scientific curiosity, to systematically investigate, is there any credibility to the Christian faith?
Because science had played such an instrumental role in his turn to atheism, Strobel embarked on an investigation of major discoveries in biology, chemistry, cosmology, and physics. His studies spanned more than 20 years and included interviews with scientists and scholars as he sought to determine for himself what these discoveries implied about the reality of a creator.
Mostly with frauds and philosophers that would lead the viewer to believe there is some grand conundrum within the field of biology and other sciences. Also, Craig accepts evolution, one of those Christians you were so incredulous about.
Throughout his inquiry, one question remained constant. Does the evidence uncovered by contemporary science point us toward or away from the existence of God?
Two-time Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling once said that science should be the search for truth. And that's what I wanted to do. I didn't know where the evidence was ultimately going to take me, but I really did want to know the truth about God. And what I found shocked me, and it stunned me.
Strobel's search began with an examination of evidence that challenged materialistic theories of life's origin. He discovered that this negative evidence contradicted the textbook explanations that had once convinced him the blind forces of evolution could account for the creation and diversity of life on Earth.
A good example of negative evidence is the 1953 Origin of Life experiment by Stanley Miller, the one that helped lead me into atheism in the first place. As biologist Jonathan
Jonathan Wells is indeed a molecular biologist, which is a step up from John Morris Pendleton and Ken Ham, but still no dice. See, when some experts in the field get out of the rigors of peer review, some just start up their own blogs and start throwing out whatever crap they want people to believe and use their doctorates to give them an air of professionalism. Mr. Wells is no exception. He is known for misquoting others to suit his agenda, writing for the World Nut Daily, and even being an AIDS denier.
Wells explained to me, Miller's experiment has now been thoroughly discredited.
Stanley Miller put together a glass apparatus, and in that apparatus he put a mixture of gases that people...
The Discovery Institute, still sour after losing the Kitzmiller case, are we?
at the time thought reflected the atmosphere of the early Earth. And those gases were methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. But then the professional opinion of what was there on the early Earth changed. In the 60s, geochemists revised their hypothesis and decided that the hydrogen, being very light, would have escaped into outer space. The Earth's gravity isn't strong enough to...
Where's the evidence of this? I don't see any here. The thing about gases is that gravity is not the only force that keeps gases on Earth. What Wells isn't telling the audience is about the layers that heavier gases can form, and a thing about real vacuums. Vacuums in scientific terms do not suck air. They just present an empty space for the air pressure around it to force the air into the space. The Earth presents a space in which air pressure is highest at the lowest altitudes, closer to the ground level. Gravity is also the strongest, and air pressure is lower at higher altitudes. This explains why gases don't just escape into space. There's more air pressure keeping them on Earth and less pushing gases into space. There is much more to this, so if I get something wrong, please correct me. It's also a bit like saying, oh, warm air is lighter than cold air, so why isn't warm air just escaping into space?
hold it. And probably the early Earth's atmosphere then consisted of what we now see coming out of volcanoes today, namely carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor. Well, if the early Earth's atmosphere consisted of those gases, then Stanley Miller's experiment would not work. In fact, he himself tried it with those gases, and he found that he couldn't produce any amino acids at all. So the experiment falls apart once you use a more realistic mixture of gases in the apparatus.
Miller-Urey's second experiment tested for volcanic conditions and yielded a wide variety of compounds. Where Wells gets this is anyone's guess, since nothing is really cited in this documentary. Here's an excerpt from an article on the Miller-Urey experiment. Files associated with the original published experiment contain far more organic molecules than Stanley Miller realized. 14 amino acids and 5 amines. The 11 vials scientists recovered from the unpublished aspirator experiment, however, produced 22 amino acids and the same 5 amines that yields comparable to the original experiment.
Miller's test has been repeated many times using the correct atmospheric components. The results are always the same. The amino acids that generated so much enthusiasm in 1953 do not appear.
Even if Miller's experiment were valid, you're still light years away from making life. It comes down to this. No matter how many
To understand the importance of these amino acids in the makeup of cells, we need to understand their importance as building blocks of life. Certain amino acids come together to form chains called polypeptides. It is important to note that the combination of amino acids determine what is made. Once we have DNA, it needs to go through transcription to RNA, which uses specific codons in the process and becomes a single strand. These codons are then translated and turned into polypeptides and create proteins. The amino acid sequence determines the structure and function of a protein. Different proteins have different combinations of amino acids that determine their function and structure. Note, while we refer to DNA as a code, that is only a method of explanation that we can understand rather than an actual code, as these are chemical reactions.
molecules you can produce with early Earth conditions, plausible conditions, you're still nowhere near producing a living cell. And here's how I know. If I take a sterile test tube and I put in it a little bit of fluid with just the right salts, just the right balance of acidity and alkalinity, just the right temperature, the perfect solution for a living cell, and I put in it one living cell. This cell is alive. It has everything it needs for life. Now I take a sterile needle and I poke that cell, and all its stuff leaks out into this test tube. You have in this nice little test tube all the molecules you need for a living cell. Not just the pieces of the molecules, but the molecules themselves. And you cannot make a living cell out of them. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Wait. So if we got a cell or a living person and we can't just put them back together and reanimate them, that means life couldn't have naturally come about? Quick, guys, call the reanimator! What this ignoramus doesn't tell you is that if you kill a cell, of course you're not just going to bring it back to life after the more complex components, like the mitochondria, nucleus, etc., come spilling out. What a stupid non-argument this is.
Experiment was not the only unsuccessful attempt to explain how life originated. Beginning with Russian chemist Alexander Oparin's work in the 1920s, theorists have also proposed chance, chemical attraction, and biological seeding from outer space as possible answers. Each has failed to account for how non-living chemicals could have arranged themselves into the most basic components of the first living cell.
The evolution of the cell is well documented, and I can find this with this simple Google search. Yet this crank can't even figure out stuff a non-PhD holding layman like myself can figure out. It goes like this. The earlier cells were bacteria that were primitive and contained a few organelles like the nucleus, and they used photosynthesis to create the food that they needed to survive the same way plants do now. They also produce oxygen through the same process that plants do, which is how Earth started getting oxygen in the atmosphere. There were different types of bacteria that existed on Earth, but eventually got absorbed into larger cells and performed useful functions for the larger cell, mitochondria and the chloroplast. This process is detailed in the endosymbiotic theory. Parasite Eve just made that much more sense. Free the mitochondria! Also, extremophiles exist. Duh!
Strobel's research ultimately led him to conclude that materialistic explanations for the origin of life were deeply flawed. And his examination of negative evidence did not end with the question of first life. He also learned of weaknesses in the most celebrated icon of Darwinian evolution,
In Darwin's book on the origin of species, there's only one illustration. It's called the Tree of Life. Darwin used it to explain how every species of animal and plant that ever existed on Earth had evolved from the same common ancestor through small, gradual steps over enormous periods of time. Even though Darwin's Tree of Life is included in virtually every biology textbook published over the last half-century, contrary to what we've been told, there is no conclusive evidence of the common origin of all life.
Perhaps the most damaging blow to Darwin's theory is the fossil record. If all living organisms have descended from the same primitive life form, then the rock strata of the Earth should be filled with the fossilized remains of animals that were once part of a great evolutionary chain. A chain of small biological modifications, ultimately leading to a spectacular diversity of life. Yet, after 2 centuries of research, highlighted by excavations in southern China, the multitude of transitional experiments, or missing links, that should exist, are conspicuous only by their absence. The most graphic example of this void in the fossil record is a geological era known as the Cambrian explosion.
The branching tree pattern of Darwin's theory is actually not seen anywhere in the fossil record unless we impose it with our own minds. So the Cambrian explosion is the most dramatic refutation of the Tree of Life.
The Cambrian explosion of life was a dramatic episode in geological history.
Cambrian explosion seemingly shows complex life appearing out of nowhere, according to Wells, but if you do more research, link in the description, you would see that it was not the origin of complex life. Those fossils from before the Cambrian explosion are shown in the link below from Talk Origins. By the way, macroevolution typically encompasses speciation and above on the classifications of life.
Something else here.
The challenges to Darwinian theory have led more than 600 scientists with PhDs from major universities throughout the world to sign a document titled A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism. It reads in part, "We are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life."
These are scientists with PhDs from
Many of the signatories are just historians and philosophers of science and even an economist. And the paper itself presents a straw man that leaves out many processes involved and leaves out the fact that these mutations that lead to other forms of life are not truly random. Did these bumbling fools ever ask if these scientists accepted God done it?
Stanford and Berkeley and University of Chicago and Cambridge, major universities who've looked hard and fast at the evidence and walked away saying, I am not convinced. Maybe there's another explanation. Personally, the negative evidence forced me to conclude that Darwinism would require a blind leap of faith that I just had no good reason to make.
Strobel's rejection of Darwinism and materialistic science was also based on the large body of positive evidence for intelligent design. Evidence he first confronted in the science of cosmology, which explores the origin of the universe.
Ooh, cosmology. Let's see who they trot out for cosmology. Wait, philosophers? No astrophysicists? No astronomers? Well, I find William Lane Craig to be one of the more respectable defenders of Christianity. He is not an astrophysicist nor an astronomer, so I'm left wondering why Strobel picked philosophers. Of course, the column.
I interviewed William Lane Craig, a philosopher who has devoted much of his career to the study of cosmology and the question of origins.
From ancient Greek materialism at the time of Plato and Aristotle up through 19th century idealism, the prevailing view was that the universe is eternal, that the universe never began to exist, that the universe as a whole is, as it were, a static, timeless entity.
This belief in an eternal, unchanging universe, for centuries a pillar of Western cosmology, was unexpectedly challenged in 1915 by Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity. Einstein's equations implied a startling possibility. The cosmos.
Pro tip, when talking about general relativity, you might also want to include Einstein's 10 field equations, especially this one. It would make you look more credible.
Was not static, but instead existed in a continual state of either contraction or expansion.
Einstein did not like the idea that the universe was dynamic at all. In fact, like almost all scientists at the time, in the early 20th century, he assumed the universe was static and eternal. What's interesting and ironic is that he thought he had made some kind of mistake in his equations for the general theory of relativity. But a few years after he developed the theory, a Belgian astronomer named Lemaitre developed a model based upon his equations, which again predicted that the universe was in a continual state of expansion.
In 1929, theoretical predictions were confirmed with empirical data. At the Mount Wilson Observatory overlooking Los Angeles, astronomer Edwin Hubble studied light from distant galaxies. Hubble determined that galaxies beyond our Milky Way were moving away from us at a speed proportional to their distance from the Earth. The more distant the galaxy, the faster it is receding. Hubble's landmark discovery led most astronomers and physicists, including Albert Einstein, to a similar conclusion. If the universe is continually expanding, then at earlier points in its history, it must have been smaller and denser.
I think a good way to visualize this is to imagine that the history of the universe has somehow been photographed and made into a movie that we could play on a projector. As the projector runs forward, we watch the universe as it continually expands. But if the projector were to be stopped and were switched into reverse to make the movie run backward, then instead of watching the galaxies move farther and farther apart from each other, we'd see them draw closer and closer together.
As you trace this expansion back in time, the universe grows denser and denser and denser until finally the entire known universe is contracted down to a state of infinite density, which marked the beginning of the universe. At this point, which cosmologists call the singularity, all matter and energy, physical space and time themselves came into being. This literally represents the origin of the universe from nothing. So the startling implication of Hubble's discovery was the temporal finitude of the universe, that the universe had an absolute beginning at some point in the finite past.
Second half of the 20th century, other discoveries also pointed to a universe with a beginning. These images of the cosmic microwave background radiation document what most scientists now believe is the remnant heat generated during the universe's early history. Background radiation is found throughout the cosmos and indicates its expansion from a sudden, perhaps violent moment in time. This evidence for a finite universe has reaffirmed the conclusion of an ancient philosophical deduction. It is called the Kalam cosmological argument.
The Kalam argument is deceptively simple in its formulation. It consists of basically three steps. Premise one is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being uncaused out of absolutely nothing. Premise two is that the universe began to exist. And the remarkable development that has occurred is that for the first time, we now have solid scientific evidence for the truth of that second premise that the universe began to exist. And from those two premises, it follows logically, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause of its existence. And that points to a reality beyond the universe, a transcendent reality beyond space and time, and therefore non-physical and immaterial, which created the universe out of nothing and brought it into being.
Yep, rather insultingly simple, but still doesn't get us to a god. This is the part where creationists will use the rationalist. We can reason something into existence via pure reasoning instead of the empiricist method of hard evidence. The problem with this is even if they rule out other causes, that does not mean we can just put God done it and be done with it. How do we know universe creating pixies didn't do it with this logic? Hell, creationists can't tell us how spoken words in an incantation spell creates matter out of nothing. No, this doesn't mean that non-physical, immaterial, invisible being outside space-time created the universe from nothing. Craig here skipped several steps.
The implications of a finite universe, coupled with other discoveries of modern cosmology, have led many scientists to unmistakably theological conclusions. There is no ground for supposing that matter and energy existed before and was suddenly galvanized into action. It is simpler to postulate creation ex nihilo, divine will constituting nature from nothingness.
The chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply, at a definite moment in time, in a flash of energy and light.
We can't understand the universe in any clear way without the supernatural.
Supernatural creation of the universe in a flash.
A bunch of quote mining and arguments from authority. Nice. Once again, these guys are skipping several steps, and through the power of pure reason, they think they can just say God done it and be done with it. No, that's not how science works.
Flash of energy and light. You know, it sounds an awful lot like the first chapter of Genesis to me. Today, the vast majority of even the most skeptical astronomers and cosmologists believe that the universe had a beginning. This belief isn't based on some theological doctrine. It's based on scientific evidence. And I think if we follow the evidence wherever it points clearly and powerfully and persuasively in the direction of a creator.
Since the beginning of time, all the matter in the universe has been governed by precisely balanced laws and constants. During an interview with Robin Collins, a philosopher with degrees in mathematics and physics, Strobel learned how these laws offer compelling evidence for a creator and conspire to make the universe habitable for life.
The laws of physics are balanced on a razor's edge for life to occur. For example, if you didn't have some...
fine-tuning it is, then. Tell me, if the universe was so fine-tuned for life, then why is life, as far as we know, so rare? If the universe was fine-tuned for life, we should already see numerous planets teeming with life forms and several civilizations in most star systems, and life forms not having to struggle to adapt to their already pristine environments. Yet we don't see this. What we actually see is life adapting to the environments in which it exists. It may seem that the Earth is fine-tuned for us, but that is because we adapt so well. We actually don't know the perfect circumstances for all life, just what is possible for life on Earth.
Something like gravity that pulled matter together. You would never get planets, you wouldn't get stars, you wouldn't get any complex organisms. If you didn't have the strong nuclear force, there would be nothing to hold protons and neutrons together in the nucleus. And so you wouldn't have any atoms, so no chemistry. If you didn't have the electromagnetic force, you would have no bonding between chemicals. You'd have no light, and the list goes on. So you need all these sorts of fundamental principles have to be in place in order for life to occur. Wipe out one of those principles, wipe out one of those laws, no life.
What's this about wiping out the laws of the universe? Are you about to confuse prescriptive laws with descriptive laws and imply they need a lawgiver?
Strobel learned that life also hinges on the precise strengths and relative values of many different physical constants. One example of this fine-tuning is the force of gravity.
Imagine a ruler divided up into 1-inch increments and then stretched across the entire universe, a distance of some 14 billion light years. For the purposes of illustration, the ruler represents the possible range for gravity. In other words, the setting for the strength of gravity could have been anywhere along the ruler, but it just happens to be situated in exactly the right place so that life is possible. Now, if you were to change the force of gravity by moving the setting just 1 inch compared to the entire width of the universe, the effect...
But you see, that inch on a ruler may seem small in comparison, but that could account for a distance of 0.99 to 1.70 astronomical units, which is freaking huge. But yeah, let's just bamboozle the audience by comparing to the size of the freaking universe.
on life would be catastrophic.
No large-scale life forms could exist. Anything that was more than the size of a pea would be completely crushed. So you might be able to get life of a very, very primitive sort, such as bacteria, but you could never get conscious observers.
The strength of gravity is just one of at least 30 separate parameters that must be finely tuned to produce a life-sustaining universe. Another example is the cosmological constant.
The cosmological constant describes the expansion speed of space in the universe. If space expands too quickly, then the universe will spread out so quickly that material objects can't form. So you can't get stars and galaxies and planets and the types of things that we, of course, take for granted in our universe.
Physicists have determined that the cosmological constant is fine-tuned to 1 part in 100 million billion 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 billion. Such precision has been compared to traveling hundreds of miles into space, then throwing a dart at the Earth and hitting a bullseye measuring 1/trillionth of an inch in diameter, an area less than the width of a single atom.
Just consider those two parameters, gravity and the cosmological constant. Their level of fine-tuning is to a precision of 1 part in 100 million trillion 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 trillion. I mean, that's like 1 atom in the entire known universe.
This fine-tuning is also evident at the atomic level. The strong nuclear force binds atoms together. If the strength of this force were to decrease by 1 part in 10,000 billion 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 billion, the only element left in the universe would be hydrogen. Again, chemical life would not be possible. The fine-tuning of the laws and forces of physics is so precise that few theorists are comfortable invoking mere chance as an explanation, unless our universe is not the only roll of the dice.
If the universe looks like it's fine-tuned for complex life, maybe there's a fine-tuner. Maybe it was fine-tuned for life. And this has certain unsavory theological implications. And so it's not surprising that those committed to a fundamentally materialistic view of reality would try to find an escape hatch. And the most popular escape hatch for this theological implication of fine-tuning is this idea of multiple universes.
This is theoretical physics at work that involves some speculation, but it's not a stab in the dark. It usually involves a white hole that could have come from another universe after it entered a black hole, or it could have something to do with quantum mechanics, see Krauss's universe from nothing. Here's this obsession with something that must purposely make things again. So do these morons understand margin of error?
As its name suggests, the theory of multiple universes proposes that our universe is not alone. Instead, it is part of a vast ensemble of universes, each with a different set of laws and constants.
If there's only one universe, then the conclusion that the universe looks fine-tuned because it is fine-tuned is inescapable. But if our universe is just one of a vast set, then you seem to have more resources to play with. Chance gets a new lease on life. I sometimes try to imagine what physicists have in mind that postulate this idea of multiple universes. I mean, what would the generator look like that creates them? Maybe it's like a giant monolith that has dozens of different dials, each of which has to be set to the right physical constant.
If we think of these parameters as dials, each of the dials is different. So if you produce enough universes with enough different dial settings, eventually, just by chance, you get one just right. So you might have to produce a trillion universes. But eventually, if you have a generator that's just spitting out just an enormous number of them, then it gets the right dial setting. And then, by just chance, you get conditions right for life. So it's a huge cosmic lottery. That's the idea.
It's an interesting idea. I mean, there's really only one problem with it. There's no independent evidence that it's true. Besides, it really just pushes the question back a step, because we could still ask, who built the generator?
The suggestion of multiple universes strikes me as
They always try to sum up their opposition's position as saying things are caused by purely random chance. Well, no, just because something is not created by someone doesn't mean it is purely random.
That has dozens of different dials, each of which has to be set to the right physical constant.
If we think of these parameters as dials, each of the dials is different. So if you produce enough universes with enough different dial settings, eventually, just by chance, you get one just right. So you might have to produce a trillion universes. But eventually, if you have a generator that's just spitting out just an enormous number of them, then it gets the right dial setting. And then, by just chance, you get conditions right for life. So it's a huge cosmic lottery. That's the idea.
It's an interesting idea. I mean, there's really only one problem with it. There's no independent evidence that it's true. Besides, it really just pushes the question back a step, because we could still ask, who built the generator?
the suggestion of multiple universes strikes me as a desperate attempt to explain away the obvious, which is that the universe is finely tuned by an intelligence to sustain complex life. An intelligence that must be beyond the constraints of time and space.
Strobel's journey through a universe finely tuned for life inevitably led him home, to the blue jewel of our solar system, the planet Earth. There he encountered another array of critically balanced conditions essential to human existence.
When I was an atheist, I saw planet Earth as being one of probably billions of planets just like it all over the universe. I saw our sun as being an average, undistinguished type of a sun. I figured as I looked up at the stars at night that there must be millions and millions of advanced civilizations.
If you're going to bring up this argument, you're already destroying your previous argument of the universe being fine-tuned for life.
Out there. I just thought there was an ordinariness to our situation. This line of reasoning was totally consistent with my atheistic worldview. But what I learned later is it is not consistent with what science is revealing about the Earth.
Strobel's investigation caused him to consider the many conditions necessary for a life-sustaining planet. In the process, he was introduced to the science of astrobiology and astronomer Guillermo Gonzalez.
I'm an astrobiologist, and what motivates me is just to examine the conditions necessary.
Liar! He's an astrophysicist, or was before he was denied tenure and jumped on the Discovery Institute bandwagon.
For life. and look elsewhere in the universe and see if those conditions are met anywhere else. And the answer could be yes, and the answer could be no, and either answer is interesting.
For more than a decade, Guillermo Gonzalez has researched the characteristics of a planet required to support complex life. Estimates vary, but a current list of these factors would number at least 20 and include an oxygen-rich atmosphere, liquid water and large continental landmasses, a home star of the right temperature and mass, an orbital path that is neither too far nor too close to the home star, a moon large enough to stabilize the tilt of the planet's axis and the movement of its tides, a magnetic field strong enough to deflect the sun's radiation, and a position in the relatively narrow habitable region of a spiral galaxy.
All these factors have to be met at one place and time in the galaxy if you're going to have a planet as habitable as the Earth, which you need for complex and even technological life.
Theorists have attempted to
Because of the very tools created by man, using the brains that we eventually evolved to have, the very science and tools you guys besmirch when it conflicts with your preset ideas.
calculate the odds of all the necessary factors for life appearing at the same time on the same planet. A conservative estimate is 1 chance in 10 to the negative 15th, or 1/1000th of 1/1 trillionth. On those terms, even when compared to the billions of suns and possible planets in our Milky Way galaxy, the probability of even a single habitable world appears unlikely.
There are many probabilistic resources in the galaxy, but on the other side of the coin are all these factors that you need. You have to get just right in order to have just one habitable planet like the Earth. And that leads me to conclude that yes, we're rare in the galaxy.
Gonzalez's study of the Earth's habitability led him and colleague Jay Richards to expand the scope of their research. They began to examine how a life-sustaining planet like Earth may also give its human inhabitants access to the mysteries of the universe.
I don't think there has ever been a time in the history of the human race in which at least some people haven't contemplated these questions. We asked, why can we...
Because of the very tools created by man, using the brains that we eventually evolved to have, the very science and tools you guys besmirch when it conflicts with your preset ideas.
See distant galaxies, millions of light years away in the universe. Why can we postulate what's going on inside atoms or inside black holes? Why are we able to discover things about the universe, to answer questions about its age? For most scientific discoveries that we're able to make, these sorts of things can't be explained in terms of the survival of the fittest of our distant ancestors. Not only our ability to do science, but the openness of the natural world to science just completely outstrips the sort of reductionist and Darwinian explanations that we're used to.
What? Nobody is reducing anything to Darwin's ideas but what reflects reality. Design for our discovery? No, the universe would exist even without any human to observe it.
In response to this evidence, Richards and Gonzalez have argued that our ability to make scientific discoveries is no fluke or accident. Instead, it points to an underlying purpose behind the universe. It is actually designed for discovery.
Guillermo Gonzalez and I spent several years pursuing a hypothesis that those rare things that life needs in a planetary environment, those things that make a planet habitable, also set up the best set of conditions overall for scientific discovery.
There are many examples of this correlation, including our planet's oxygen-rich atmosphere, both a critical requirement for our survival and a transparent window that allows us to explore the distant universe. The Earth's precise distance from the Sun and the size of its moon and home star. These factors not only control our planet's temperature, axial tilt, and the movement of its tides, they also ensure perfect solar eclipses, phenomena that have provided scientists with invaluable data about the composition of stars and the properties of light, and our location in the Milky Way. The Earth is positioned between two spiral arms within a relatively small region where life is possible. As a result, we enjoy an excellent platform for clear, unimpeded views of our galaxy and the rest of the cosmos.
Do you have any friggin' idea how many filters we need to use in order to see most of those oh so wonderful things in the galaxy? Are you freaking kidding me?
I think God intentionally created a habitat for us that allows us to see Him through the creation that He has left behind. And this habitat is conducive for us to do scientific research. It didn't have to be that way, but it is. Why? Because I believe that by doing science, we find God.
The final leg of Strobel's investigation transported him from the deepest reaches of the cosmos to the microscopic universe of the living cell and the science of biochemistry. There he encountered more challenges to Darwinian evolution and new evidence of design. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, spectacular technologies revolutionized scientific understanding of the cell, the basic unit of life. During an interview with biochemist Michael Behe, Strobel learned how this new knowledge has
Irreducible complexity. Still bandying that about when it lost you the Kitzmiller case. Really?
shaken the foundations of Darwin's theory.
In the 19th century, when Darwin was alive, scientists thought that the basis of life, the cell, was some simple glob of protoplasm, like a little piece of jello or something that was not hard to explain at all. But with the hard work of science in the 20th century, we've seen that the cell is far from simple. It's got very complicated molecular machines and things that are very resistant to Darwinian explanation.
Michael Behe has devoted his career to the study of the design and operation of the cell. He has also written extensively on the biochemical challenge to evolution.
Most people have no idea of how small and complex cells are.
See, this is how it goes. They claim that the bacterial flagellum is so perfectly put together that if you take apart anything from it, it just won't work. It's irreducibly complex. Well, no. Instead of the flagellum propelling the cell through whatever body it is in, it can be reduced to a secretory mechanism. This mechanism can either inject a cell with toxins or secrete these toxins along the cell wall.
A typical cell from you or me, called a eukaryotic cell, is probably 1/10 of the size of the head of a pin. And yet in that single cell, there are about 3 billion units of DNA making out the chromosomes. And those 3 billion units make the molecular machines of the cell, literally machines that make the cell work.
With computer animation, we can enter the cell. Here, the staggering complexity of its molecular machinery is clearly seen.
It's like going into an automobile factory. The factory has a large number of machines. The parts have to fit together in very specific ways to do their jobs, and if things go wrong, the cell is in big trouble. And just one cell is enormously complex, but humans, you and I, are made from trillions of cells, and those.
Tell me, Behe, If the cell is so perfectly designed, or if bacteria is so perfectly designed, why do we see so many errors in the genetic makeup of certain cells, like in sickle cell anemia? And why do you keep peddling this lie despite the bacterial flagellum not being irreducibly complex?
Trillions of cells have to fit together in the right way and do their own job. Darwinism was a lot more plausible when we were thinking about globs of protoplasm than it is when we're thinking about molecular machines.
Each of these biochemical machines is a masterpiece of engineering and nanotechnology. They are essential to functions as vital and diverse as vision, photosynthesis, and the production of energy in the cell. Michael Behe has studied several of these machines, including the flagellum, a remarkable rotary motor.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called a bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the...
Irreducible complexity can be illustrated by a familiar, non-biological machine, a mousetrap. The trap is composed of 5 basic pieces: a catch to hold the bait, a strong spring, a thin bent rod called the hammer, a holding bar to secure the hammer in place, and a platform upon which the entire system is mounted. If any one of these parts is missing or defective, the mechanism will not work. All components of this irreducibly complex system must be present simultaneously for the machine to perform its function. Catching mice. The concept of irreducible...
Well, that turns out not to be true. And I'll give you an example. What I have right here is a mousetrap from which I've removed 2 of the 5 parts. I still have the base plate, the spring, and the hammer. Now, you can't catch any mice with this, so it's not a very good mousetrap. But it turns out that despite the missing parts, it makes a perfectly good, if somewhat inelegant, tie clip.
Complexity also applies to biological machines, including the bacterial flagellum.
All told, there are about 40 different protein parts which are necessary for this machine to work. And if any of those parts are missing, then either you get a flagellum that doesn't work because it's missing the hook or it's missing the drive shaft or whatever, or it doesn't even get built within the cell. You can't put something like that together gradually because...
Formation arose through natural selection acting upon non-living molecules, or the self-organizing power of chemicals in a primordial soup, have repeatedly failed. Even time and blind chance, the oft-invoked saviors of implausible biological scenarios, have fallen far short as accounts for the source of the instructions in DNA. Mathematicians, for example, have calculated that a universe filled with monkeys, typing relentlessly throughout the oldest estimated age of the cosmos, would have no realistic chance of producing Shakespeare's play Hamlet, let alone a transcript of the genetic information required to build a living cell.
Based on our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all...
Alright, that's it.
That's my...
All scientific reasoning about the past, there is only one known cause for the origin of information, and that cause is intelligence. Whether we're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription, a section of text in a book, or a computer software, if you have information and you trace it back to its source, invariably you come to an intelligence. Therefore, when you find information inscribed along the backbone of the DNA molecule in the cell, the most rational inference, based on our repeated experience, is that an intelligence of some kind played a role in the origin of that information.
Again, these are chemical reactions. The only reason why we refer to it as a code is to make it easier for us to understand. Chemical reactions are different than languages. I hope you can now figure out why the Discovery Institute should not be trusted in any scientific matters, and why I think it is inaccurate when a creationist says that he knows evolutionary theory, and why I say the modern scientific consensus on evolutionary theory is correct.